Welcome back to class. Okay, today shifting gears a little bit. We've been bouncing back and forth between Cold War stuff and kind of looking at foreign policy and then domestic policy and the civil rights movement. This obviously, as you can see from the title heading that I have on the screen there behind me, this is going to tie into civil rights notes now. Initially, we had talked about kind of the origins of the civil rights movement, like Jackie Robinson, and then the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the Emmett Till lynching. Okay, and then the first big protest in the 1950s was the Montgomery bus boycott that Martin Luther King had coordinated. But I had also said in the last chunk, kind of the 1960s civil rights protest part one, that things really heat up in the 1960s. That's when I think the civil rights movement picks up a ton of momentum and gets going. And it's just a tumultuous decade, kind of from any angle you want to look at it, but especially from the prism of looking at American history through like civil rights and what's going on there. So for the first part, I had also said too that there's a lot of different leaders. Martin Luther King is the most recognizable one that I'll probably talk about the most and had probably the largest impact. But a lot of different leaders, like we had talked about in part one, the freedom rides and sit-in protests, neither of those were started or initiated by Martin Luther King, but he was very supportive of those protests, of the freedom riders and anybody that was going to go into a segregated lunch counter and do a sit-in protest. Today, I'm hitting one specific protest that Martin Luther King does coordinate and put together, and he is the man kind of running this protest. So for this one, for part two, you don't really have to put the part two in your notes. If you are jotting down notes like I recommend, the thing that I would want you to have would be like in your civil rights notes, in the Birmingham, marching in Birmingham or Birmingham, Alabama, something to that effect. Now, Martin Luther King specifically chose Birmingham, Alabama, because a very key thing that I'd have you add in about it, many people would have said that that is the most racist and segregated city in America back in the early 1960s. You might think, like, why the heck would you go into the place where, you're going to make the most trouble and in the most racist city? Why don't you start in kind of a mid-tier city that's just a little bit racist? That kind of defeats the purpose of like his style of peaceful protest and civil disobedience. Remember, he can go lead a protest in a city down south, but the 1960s now, we're living in the television modern era where things are going to increasingly get caught on film. He's not just trying to win sympathy in one small town down in the South or, just targeting one. He wants to motivate the whole nation. Martin Luther King wants to win over as many sympathetic white people across the country as he possibly can. And actually, in many cases, he's probably going to have more success winning over sympathetic white people in the Midwest, in the North, and out in the Western states, in places like Michigan or New York or California. He's probably more likely to win white sympathy there than he would be in the Deep South. But the most intense racism is in the Deep South, in cities across Alabama, Mississippi, but really almost everywhere down there, the kind of where the Jim Crow laws are. So he specifically targets Birmingham, Alabama, and he coordinates a massive protest and has people come in from way outside of that city to come in and protest. And he also tells reporters, because he wants this to get caught on camera, and it's very important for the optics of it, that he'll just kind of strike that contrast between peaceful protesters and the police getting very violent, and that's an effective tool at winning over a lot of white America at the time. So he picks this most segregated city because he's kind of counting on the fact that the police down there, the very racist sheriff, this guy named Bull Connor, and the deputies that work for him, that they would basically get out of line and give Martin Luther King and the protesters some really good photo ops that would get them a bunch of sympathy, right? And kind of help them to, initiate reforms and be a catalyst for change. So this guy, I would put him in your notes too. Bull Connor, they basically chose this town, from what I know of it, because this guy was the sheriff. O'Connor, what a kind of ominous sounding, old Southern sheriff name for you. He rigidly enforced the Jim Crow laws and the segregation laws. He is an old school kind of plain talking, stereotypical, racist white Southern sheriff if I ever saw one. I'll show you a photo of him on the next one, but he would just very cavalierly say horrifically racist things on camera. He was very open and outspoken about it. You'll hear him, like, if you ever see video of him, just dropping the N-bomb right and left. And he was very open about his racism. So it wasn't like a secret. It's not like that's an allegation that's being made about him that maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I think in his own words, he would own that behavior, and he would kind of took pride in his rigid segregation, his very racist attitudes, and that was pretty common in a lot of places in the South. So maybe he symbolically represented a lot of Southern towns in that kind of way. Anyway, they choose Birmingham, Alabama to do peaceful protests out in the streets. Now, remember, Martin Luther King, his style of protest that he had studied Gandhi do it in India. He had studied Henry David Thoreau from 100 years before in America in the 1800s do civil disobedience style protests. The key thing about it, you're going to go disobey an unjust law, but you have to do it in a peaceful way for it to be civil disobedience. And that's the way it's the most effective, because if you're going and disobeying an unjust law, but then it all breaks down and the people that are the protesters start doing rioting and looting and burning, that's not going to win you much sympathy. That's going to make it look like, well, maybe the police are justified in that, and these people are way out of line. So Martin Luther King would specifically say, like, before these marches would start, he would gather people up and say, hey, brothers and sisters, we are going to go out and protest. Some rotten things are going to happen to you. There is going to be violence, but no matter what happens to you, you cannot get violent back. If you are not 100% sure that you can stay nonviolent in my protest, I appreciate you wanting to help, but if you can't do that, I don't want you here. Go home. Don't take part in this. And he had a tremendous amount of respect. And so I think, by and large, the protests where he was there and he kind of administered that and ran it ahead of time, did stay peaceful for the most part. It was very rare for any of the Martin Luther King protests to get violent. Now, there's a lot of other protests in the 1960s, especially after Martin Luther King gets assassinated, that get horribly violent. Anyway, we'll get more into that down the road. But King always advocated these peaceful protests. So that's a very key part of any protest that he's going to lead. Now, Martin Luther King also, here's the thing, they're going to go in Birmingham and they're going to protest segregation and they're going to be marching in the streets, which this sheriff, even though you think that in the First Amendment, people have the right to peacefully assemble, and sometimes you have to go get permits and stuff, or, go register with local authorities, but that's a constitutional right to go out and march in the streets and peacefully protest, assemble together. But this Southern sheriff in the town of Birmingham, Alabama did not want that at all. So they were basically saying, you don't do that. You don't come out and protest and tie up our streets. We're going to hit you with things like obstruction of traffic, and we're going to arrest you all and throw you into jail. Now, this was the first time. The reason I chose this one, Birmingham, Alabama does attract national attention. Martin Luther King also gets arrested. You may have heard of letters from a Birmingham jail, where he does a lot of famous correspondence while he is incarcerated for being out and peacefully protesting, and they think they can arrest him and that'll just diffuse everything. But it doesn't really happen that way, as protesters stay at it even after King gets arrested. And this is one of the first times that Martin Luther King decides to use young people, which is a controversial thing. So make sure you include that in there too. It's the first time that Martin Luther King, and kind of within the civil rights, college level kids had done quite a bit of protesting up to this point and had taken a lot of leadership roles. But this is the first time he has literally junior high and high school age kids out there marching and protesting in the streets. And you might say, well, if you think things are going to get violent and this sheriff's really racist and they're expecting that he's going to come out there with fire hoses and police dogs and, be smashing them with billy clubs. And who knows, people might even end up dying at this protest. Why the heck would you have kids out there? Well, I think Martin Luther King's calculation in his head, from what I know of it, he was guessing that it's not going to get to the point where the police are going to be just shooting and gunning everybody down out on the streets. That would look really, really bad and be a gross overreach of the state's power. So he's gambling on they're probably not going to go out and just openly murder people, but it is probably going to get rough and violent and all that, and they are probably going to arrest a ton of the protesters. Well, think about it. Most of these black families that are out there and would be supportive of him and joining in the protest, most of them are working class. Some are very poor. If the mom and dad in the family, or even just say the dad gets arrested and the family has no income coming in, that can be hugely negatively impact the whole family. You could have kids go into bed hungry, can be disruptive. They might lose their job. But these kids, they're junior high, high school age. If they end up getting arrested, is it that big a deal? Well, they're juveniles. I mean, it's not even going to be a crime it's not a felony to do this. It's a misdemeanor. So it's not going to stay on their record their whole life. They should be going to school, not work. So it's not like it's going to really impact their family in a financial way negatively. And if you're watching it on TV and you see policemen out there just whacking kids with billy clubs and hitting them with fire hoses and dogs biting them, I mean, the younger the protester is, as long as they're not being violent, man, that changes the optics of it too. It really, really makes the police look like bullies and jerks if they're out there doing it to fairly young kids. So I think, all things considered, it was probably, and it wasn't like the police did not go out there and just kind of exterminate everybody or start firing a machine gun into the crowd. I think it was probably a pretty smart decision, a wise call that Martin Luther King had thought very deeply about. And then you'll see students, younger people are used a lot moving forward in many of these civil rights protests. It does get very violent in Birmingham, and police cameras are out there, and man, the footage is rolling, and it is hitting the nightly news every night when this starts happening. So some really famous images for you down low here. That's a good close-up of the sheriff, Bull Connor. I don't know what you had envisioned in your head, but when I heard stories about this guy and then I actually saw him in life and saw him in some interviews, I'm like, yeah, he fits with that's exactly what I had envisioned. Maybe not for you, but it kind of was for me. But some of the most famous images that you'll see from the Birmingham protest, you have police out there. Now, it's a mix. There are older people and younger people, but a lot of high school age kids out there. This image in the top left, where it's a German Shepherd police dog biting that young man, very famous image, hits the nightly news, hits a lot of newspapers. You can see dozens of images like the one I have over here in the top right, where kids are getting hit with fire hoses. So in order to clear the streets out, they didn't want to shoot them and start murdering people, but they wanted to make them, they wanted to give them a little bit of pain and suffering. So Bull Connor authorizes the use of getting out the fire hoses, which it is not like getting shot with your, little house garden hose in the backyard. That's kind of fun and you might play with as a kid. These fire hoses are super high pressure. A tremendous amount of water comes out of them very fast. Usually you would have several grown men holding those hoses just to keep it under control, because one guy holding onto it, there's so much pressure going through, a lot of times can't control those fire hoses. So think about being on the receiving end of that. If you're 20, 30 feet away and it's that high pressure, basically getting shot with that stream of water, I mean, it's almost like getting hit continuously, like with a baseball bat or something. These people had welts and bruises on them. You can find some of, if you want to go look it up on YouTube, and I may try to include a few of these on the post. There are videos of kids getting hit with the fire hose and not having anything to hold on to. Like you would try to hold on to a street lamp or a garbage can or something or a building, like these people are here. But if you weren't holding on to anything, it'll literally knock you off your feet and just like boom, push you down the street. And he was clearing people out that way. Now you can imagine average Joe Schmo American up here in Michigan who's in a small town, farmer or something like that, and is watching this on the evening news. How does that look to those people? Whether you're white, whether you're black, man, most people are disgusted by that. And they're like, my God, I can't believe that it's like getting that extreme down there. Like, and people start asking questions like, what is it that these protesters were doing? What are they talking about? And it's like, oh, they're protesting segregation. And what were they doing? They're just out marching in the streets, like singing gospel songs and stuff. And it's like, it seems like a big overreaction by the police department, and that is the overwhelming consensus across the country. So anyway, the peaceful protests, the civil disobedience tactics like this, especially when used with younger people and they absolutely stay nonviolent, boy, it's a very powerful optic, and I think it pushes a lot of Americans. This is 1963 now when this is happening. It pushes a lot of Americans over to kind of just being more sympathetic to the cause of the civil rights movement and Black equality and integration. And it really makes these kind of racist Southerners that are in power, these racist Southern sheriffs that like Bull Connor is one of the most notorious ones. It makes them look like scumbags and jerks. And really starts to turn the American public against them. Hopefully, this made sense to you. I would recommend if you're interested in this topic, there's a ton of information out there about the Birmingham protests. Go out there and dig into it on your own if you're interested in it. I know they've made some movies about it, and you can find just a plethora of good images on Google and good videos of it on YouTube. So I'll try to pick out a couple to include on this lesson post that you can view after this if you're interested. And you know, if I don't have enough on there, go do some digging on your own, be a historian, and track down some stuff that interests you and educates you. All right, take care.